Greetings, my name is Stan Prager from the Regarp book blog, regarp.com. Today's podcast features my review of God of Revolution, The Turbulent Flight of Jefferson Airplane by Jeff Tamarkin. On August 11th, 2013, my wife and I were eagerly settling in at the Katharine Hepburn Cultural Arts Center, popularly known as the Kate, in Old Saybrook, Connecticut. Truly pumped for the upcoming show that evening with Marty Balin, the primary founder of the groundbreaking psychedelic rock group Jefferson Airplane, one of its principal lead vocalists and songwriters, and an indisputable icon of the 60s San Francisco music scene. But when he took the stage with his band, Marty clearly was not pleased. The Kate is a wonderful, intimate venue, a gorgeous little theater with a capacity of only 285. The sightline and acoustics great from any angle. But what Marty spotted from his vantage point was the number of seats that remained unoccupied, and you could tell it put him in a sour mood from the get-go. About midway through the show, before he launched into the tune Miracles, a top hit from Jefferson Starship, the 70s band that was a direct descendant of the Airplane, he snarkily advised his mostly graying audience that he usually saved this one for the encore, but he'd go ahead and do it now in case anyone had to split and go check in on the babysitter. The collective wince that went around the room was palpable. But he sounded fantastic. Magnificent, actually. If you closed your eyes, you'd think that the sweet, soulful tenor that hit every high note effortlessly was being projected from the lips of the dynamic 23-year-old powerhouse who created the Airplane back in '65, rather than the dour 71-year-old emblem of the disillusion that stood before us. I tried to tell him that, too, in the sparsely attended meet and greet that followed the show, but it was not received as intended. "Man, you sounded amazing," I gushed. "If I was in another room, I would have thought the singer was still in his 20s. Marty regarded me coolly. "I'm not old," he grumbled. "I'm still young." Marty was fooling himself, of course, but he was indeed young once upon a time, in a magical place called San Francisco that became the spiritual and geographical epicenter for a profound generational shift that was identified most prominently by youth and rebellion. Back then, he was a musical wizard of sorts who conjured up an assortment of other outside talents that coalesced into a remarkable supergroup, which later churned out tunes that defined and then transcended a singular genre of rock and roll that would come to serve as a soundtrack for the zeitgeist of the times. Coming down from an all-night acid trip at Woodstock, the ethereally beautiful Grace Slick boldly proclaimed to an early morning audience, "It's a new dawn," and for a little while at least, it seemed that way. It's impossible to consider the phenomenon of the hippie counterculture and landmark moments of the mid to late 60s, from the Summer of Love to Altamont, without the iconography of Jefferson Airplane decorating the scenery. So deeply did the band cut a groove that inextricably bound it to the cultural and musical landscape of those years. And there's no doubt that Marty's fierce, towering vocals on Volunteers characterized the hard rock anthem of that epoch. Look what's happening out in the streets. Got a revolution. Got to revolution. In a highly ambitious attempt at a single-volume definitive history of the Airplane, as well as all the many offshoots, collaborations, and solo endeavors it spawned, acclaimed music journalist Jeff Tamarkin knits together extensive interviews with exhaustive research to turn out God of Revolution, The Turbulent Flight of Jefferson Airplane, a fast-paced, entertaining, if cliché-ridden and uneven account that succeeds more often than it falls short. That's a mouthful, but then so is the book and the musical sensation that it chronicles. And Tamarkin gets right to it. Conspicuous in its absence is a socio-history of the distinctive 1960s San Francisco scene that birthed the Airplane. Thus, readers unfamiliar with the cultural milieu of the pot-smoking hippies who were denizens of Haight-Ashbury and environs, as well as the anti-war politics of protest that vehemently stapled an element of rage to mantras of peace, love, and drugs, will come to this book with a decided disadvantage. The author turns first to Marty, who not only selected musicians for the Airplane, but went on to promote it at a nightclub he co-owned called The Matrix, that featured local groups such as The Doors, The Grateful Dead, and Quicksilver Messenger Service. The house band was Marty's band. The first recruit was rhythm guitarist Paul Kantner. Lead guitarist Jorma Kaukonen was next. The original bassist was replaced by Jorma's buddy Jack Cassidy. Drummers came and went, but the longest-lasting and most consequential was Spencer Dryden. The initial female vocalist was Signe Anderson, who left after having a baby. She was replaced by Grace Slick, who changed the entire dynamic of the band. A former model and debutante, Slick brought good looks and a witty, wise-ass stage persona to the game, as well as her soaring mezzo-soprano vocals that not simply attached a signature sound to Jefferson Airplane, but came to define 1960s psychedelic rock. Grace also brought with her 2 tracks from her former band with her ex-husband, The Great Society, which would become big hits for the Airplane: Somebody to Love and White Rabbit, a hallucinogenic homage to Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, brimming with surreal imagery and not-so-subtle inferences to LSD, penned by Grace after an acid trip of her own. Grace's intellectual depth and songwriting talent would prove a big influence on the band, but so too would her erratic personality. It wasn't long before factions formed and Marty lost control of his own band. Marty was a new-fashioned crooner of sorts, whose dulcet voice was wrapped around ballads and love songs. As the tunes took on a harder edge, the others came to reject Marty's influence as poppy schlock. After a series of bed-hopping adventures, Grace settled in with Paul, and they had their own ideas about the direction the music should take. Yorma, whose first love was the blues, and his friend Jack formed another block. Spencer refused to play the game and just grew alienated. In time, he was fired. It was kind of a revolving door with drummers. Tamarkin does a pretty competent job of animating the personalities involved so the reader gets to know them, but it's evident that he has far more material on some than the others. We get close up and personal with Paul and Grace, replete with anecdotes galore, but there's less nuance in his sketches of Yorma and the rest of the gang. Still, as a fan who has long admired the band, I found it discouraging to peek in on them behind the scenes. Once they tasted success, the Airplane purchased a 17-room mansion at 2400 Fulton Street in the heart of Haight-Ashbury for use as a communal residence and office space. There they proceeded to act like a bunch of spoiled rich kids, with a Dionysian penchant for wallowing in sex, drugs, alcohol, and materialism. If the sex and drugs resonated on the streets, their behavior was otherwise vastly dissimilar to the ethic of the hippie counterculture they ostensibly represented. They exhibited almost no authentic sense of social consciousness. They had guns. They had a passion for expensive toys and reckless behavior. They were consumed with petty jealousies and rivalries. Their protest politics descended into a blind devotion to Mao's China. Of all of them, Grace comes off the worst. Selfish, egotistical, unruly, provocative, grandstanding, a raging alcoholic given to violence, she once attacked Paul with a sword. The Grace who was fired from Jefferson Starship in 1978 for goose-stepping to mock a German audience was the same Grace at Fulton Street, just an older version. Some of her antics were entertaining, like when she schemed to slip acid into President Nixon's drink, when Tricia Nixon's Finch College alumni invite to a formal White House Tea Party included the former Grace Wing. She never got past security. Some were just crazy, like when she set out on an inebriated high-speed street race with Yorma that sent her off the road into an embankment. The car's driver's side was crushed, but with no seatbelt and the luck of a drunk, she incurred only minor injuries. In between such exploits, Grace delighted in promiscuity. Even in an age when free love was common, Grace took it to extremes, and she seemed incapable of fidelity to anyone. She managed to bed down with everyone in the Airplane, except Marty. Many observed that when the two performed together, it was as if they were making love before a cast of thousands. But offstage, Marty demonstrated no interest in her physically. When asked in an interview if he had ever slept with Grace, Marty famously said that he wouldn't even let her. Well, no need to repeat it here. You can Google it. If Grace's character seems to scrape the bottom, Marty's floats near the top. Hardly a burly fellow, it was Marty who leaped off the stage at Altamont to protect a concert-goer being attacked by a Hell's Angel, only to be beaten unconscious for his heroic intervention. If perhaps jealous of the way Grace sees the spotlight, and increasingly dispirited as he was sidelined by the others, his devotion to the band never flagged. But ultimately, internal tensions got to him, and in 1971 he was the first to walk away. A year later, Jefferson Airplane was history. Given the talent, conflicting ambitions, and disagreement over musical directions, it is less surprising that the Airplane crashed than that it lasted as long as it did. But the band didn't really dissolve as much as it divided. Yorma and Jack's side project, Hot Tuna, became their full-time gig and still endures today. Some terrific collaborations by Grace and Paul, my favorite is Baron von Tollbooth and the Chrome Nun, eventually evolved into Jefferson Starship. Marty contributed one song to their first album, the beautiful love ballad Caroline, and later became a permanent member of the new band. And that first effort, Dragonfly, ranks up there with some of the best of the Airplane. One of the finest tracks on that album is Ride the Tiger, which contains lyrics that boldly predict, look to the summer of '75, all the world is going to come alive. It was not to be. The era of the 60s, which some would date from JFK's 1963 assassination to Nixon's resignation in 1974, was done. Disco was ahead. LSD was passé. Coke was the new cool. And while long-haired zombies on Quaaludes masqueraded as hippies, stumbling through the garish excesses of a far less promising new dawn, it was a look, not a lifestyle. It wasn't until the final death knell of Reagan's election and the murder of John Lennon that reality sunk in. Jefferson Starship put out a couple of solid albums, but then fell into steep decline. A sad caricature of it, on and off, with and without Grace, dubbed just Starship, continues until today. I'm not a fan. Tamarkin should have closed out the volume when the Airplane ended, but instead he determined to chronicle every twist and turn of the successor bands and the various solo efforts ad infinitum, or at least until the 2003 publication date. The result is a diminished writing quality and a narrative that reads more like an extended Wikipedia entry. Disputes among members continue, personnel come and go, but it becomes a blur as the author himself seems to want to plow through all the years ahead and finally be done with it. It is unfortunate because the balance of the book detracts from the achievements of earlier chapters. When I say that I can't remember when I first started digging the Airplane, I mean that quite literally, because their music and their vibe was so entangled with my then concurrent pursuit of altering consciousness that recollections of those days are a bit murky, to say the least. But it must have been sometime around 1972, when my 15-year-old self would get high and then blast FM radio, which treated me to White Rabbit and Lather and my all-time favorite, Wooden Ships, and I started to buy their albums. Of course, by then, the Airplane had disbanded, although my voyage of discovery had just begun. I still own a large collection of Jefferson Airplane, Jefferson Starship, Hot Tuna, and various collaborations, most on the original vinyl, some on CD. And yes, the vinyl sound is vastly superior. I made a point of listening to all of it chronologically, with some help from Spotify to fill in the blanks, in the course of reading Got a Revolution. The majority of it holds up admirably, especially the Airplane album Surrealistic Pillow and Volunteers, some of the Cantner Slick efforts, Jefferson Starship's Dragonfly and Red Octopus, and much of the Hot Tuna catalog. I never stopped being a fan. In 1989, Marty, Paul, Yorma, Jack, and Grace briefly reunited Jefferson Airplane, put out a new album, and embarked on a tour. My wife and I saw them live at Lake Compounds Festival Park in Bristol, Connecticut on September 4th, 1989, with Hot Tuna as an opening act. I will never forget the thrill I experienced standing in the first rows under the stage with chills running up and down my spine during their live performance of Wooden Ships. In 1996, the Airplane, including Spencer Dryden, was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and they performed live, sans Grace, who sat out the ceremony. Grace had retired shortly after the '89 tour, and has since declared that rock is a young person's game. She quit drinking and mellowed out markedly. As this review goes to press, Grace, who casts herself as the queen of acid rock and art, passes her time at 86 as a painter of rock legends and characters from Alice in Wonderland, with her work earning critical praise. Yorma and Jack, both in their 80s, continue to tour with Hot Tuna. I have sat in on several of their shows in intimate venues. They never disappoint. Paul Kantner died at 74 on January 28, 2016, in a weird coincidence on the very same day that Signe Anderson passed away at the same age. Marty Ballin died at 76 in 2018. In later interviews, he made clear that his recollections of the Airplane were bittersweet. There's no doubt that he never really got the credit he deserved. My memory of him at the Cape, so downcast, yet lingers. It's been 61 years since the 1965 launch of Jefferson Airplane, but their music never gets old. Despite the shortcomings with Tamarkin's book, I would still recommend it. And don't forget to spin their albums while you're reading. Thank you for joining me for today's podcast. I encourage you to share it in your network. Many more reviews and an eclectic array of fiction and nonfiction books are available at regarp.com and regarpbookblogpod.com. Have a great day.